Noose at dawn, a hush falls over the dusty town of Redemption as Belle, a saloon girl accused of stealing a prospector's gold, is brought to the gallows. Dust devils dance at the edge of town, mimicking the swirling unease in Belle's stomach. The rope, thick and rough, chafed against her neck, a stark reminder of the precariousness of her life. She hadn't stolen a lick of gold, but Jedediah's word, fueled by whiskey and spite, held more weight in redemption than any saloon girl's plea of innocence. Head claimed Shed charmed him out of his poke, then vanished like smoke in a high wind. Belle's gaze swept across the grim faces of the townsfolk. She saw no sympathy, only a morbid curiosity. Their silence was a heavier condemnation than their shouts could ever be. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Shed come to redemption seeking a new start, a chance to escape the shadows of her past. Now it seemed, her journey would end beneath the unforgiving glare of the desert sun. Sheriff Brody, a man weathered by years of harsh sun and harsher justice, adjusted the noose. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a flicker of something Belle couldn't decipher. Regret? Pity? Hope? Or just the weariness of another hanging in this godforsaken town? Any last words? Brody's voice was rough as granite. Belle swallowed, the dryness in her throat making it hard to speak. She wanted to scream her innocence, to curse Jedediah and this town that had so readily condemned her. But what good were words against the weight of prejudice? She shook her head, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Just as Brody reached for the lever, a low rumble echoed through the silent square. A lone rider, silhouetted against the rising sun, emerged from the shimmering heat haze. He sat tall and straight in the saddle, his broad-brimmed hat concealing his features. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, pranced nervously, sensing the tension in the air. The rider reined in his horse at the edge of the crowd, its hooves scattering the dust. He dismounted with an almost languid grace, the movement belying the coiled strength beneath his worn leather coat. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at the expectant faces around him. His gaze was fixed solely on Belle, a silent acknowledgement of her plight. He walked towards the gallows, his spurs clinking against the hard-packed earth, each step deliberate, measured. The silence in the square was absolute, broken only by the creak of the gallows and the whisper of the wind. He stopped a few feet from Sheriff Brody, his hand resting lightly on the worn handle of his gun. Still, he didn't speak. Brody, his hand hovering over the lever, shifted uneasily. "Something I can do for you, mister." The rider reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound pouch. He tossed it to Brody, who caught it with a grunt. The sheriff opened the pouch, his eyes widening as he saw the contents. Inside, nestled amongst nuggets of gold, lay a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it, his lips moving silently as he read the words scrawled upon it. He looked up at the rider, then back at Belle, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. This is a bill of sale. For Jedediah's claim. Signed and witnessed. Dated 3 days ago." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers, like dry leaves rustling in the wind, filled the air. Jedediah, it seemed, had sold his claim, then concocted a story to explain his sudden lack of fortune. Had chosen Belle as his scapegoat, knowing she was an easy target. Brody looked at Belle, his eyes now holding a flicker of shame. He untied the noose, his hands fumbling with the knot. "Ma'am," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. I apologize for this misunderstanding." The rider, his mission accomplished, turned and walked back towards his horse. He mounted the stallion in one fluid movement, and without a backward glance, rode out of Redemption, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from whence he came. Belle stood beneath the gallows, the rope still chafing her neck, a tangible reminder of the injustice she had almost suffered. The whispers of the townsfolk, now laced with apologies and awkward explanations, washed over her. She didn't acknowledge them. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, following the trail of dust left by the lone rider. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he had chosen to intervene. But in that silent act of mercy, he had given her back more than just her life. He had given her back her faith in humanity, a faith that redemption, despite its name, had almost stolen from her. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty square. Belle took a deep breath, the desert air filling her lungs. She had survived. And in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West, survival was a victory in itself. The dust settled, leaving a gritty film on everything. Belle touched her neck, the ghost of the rope a burning brand against her skin. The townsfolk, their whispers now hushed murmurs of apology and averted gazes, began to disperse. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of shame, stood awkwardly beside the gallows, the leather pouch still clutched in his hand. He looked at Belle, opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words seemingly caught in the dryness of his throat. Belle didn't need his words. She had seen the flicker of doubt in his eyes before the rider appeared, a tiny spark of decency buried beneath layers of weariness and cynicism. It wasn't enough to save her, not until the rider arrived with proof, but it was there. And in a town like Redemption, even a flicker was something. She turned and walked away from the gallows, away from the gaping maw of death that had almost swallowed her whole. She walked with a newfound strength, a resilience forged in the fires of injustice. She didn't look back. She had no desire to see the faces of those who had so readily condemned her, those who had stood by in silent complicity while her life hung in the balance. She found her way back to the dusty saloon, the only place she could call home in this godforsaken town. The barkeep, a grizzled old man named Silas, watched her approach with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had seen his share of hangings, seen the way the town turned on those it deemed unworthy. He had expected Belle to be another notch on Redemption's weathered gallows. "Whiskey," Belle said, her voice rougher than usual. Silas nodded, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. He poured her a generous measure, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass. Belle took it with a trembling hand, the familiar burn a welcome sensation. She drank deeply, the whiskey a balm against the lingering fear that clung to her like desert dust. As she sat at the bar, the events of the morning replayed in her mind. The rider, the silent savior who had emerged from the shimmering heat like a phantom, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. Who was he? Why had he helped her? These questions swirled in her mind, unanswered. All she knew was that he had saved her, and that knowledge, for now, was enough. Days turned into weeks, the memory of the near hanging a constant shadow in Belle's life. She continued working at the saloon, her interactions with the townsfolk strained and awkward. Their apologies felt hollow, their attempts at conversation stilted. The rider, her silent protector, hadn't been seen since that fateful morning. Head vanished as quickly as head appeared, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. Then one evening, as the desert sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, a stranger rode into Redemption. He wasn't the rider, but he rode the same magnificent black stallion. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the horse's hooves scattering the dust. He walked into the saloon, his spurs clinking against the wooden floorboards. He was tall and lean, his face weathered and tanned, his eyes the color of the desert sky. He approached Belle, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Elias sent me. He said you might have some questions." Belle's heart skipped a beat. Elias, the rider's name. Finally, a piece of the puzzle. Who is he? Belle asked, her voice barely a whisper. A man who believes in justice, the stranger replied. A man who's seen too much injustice in his lifetime. Why did he help me? The stranger smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. He said you reminded him of someone. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if seeing something in the distance. Someone he lost a long time ago. He handed Belle a small leather-bound pouch, identical to the one Elias had given Sheriff Brody. He said you might need this. Belle opened the pouch. Inside, nestled amongst a few gold nuggets, was a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, her eyes widening as she read the words written upon it. It was a deed to a small plot of land just outside of Redemption. Enough land to start a new life, a life away from the shadows of the saloon and the whispers of the town. Belle looked up at the stranger, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. Tell him thank you, she said, her voice choked with emotion. The stranger nodded, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving Belle alone with her thoughts and the promise of a new beginning. She looked out the window, watching as the stranger mounted the black stallion and rode out of Redemption, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The West remained wild, unforgiving. But in that small act of kindness, Belle found a flicker of hope, a spark of light in the vast, desolate landscape. The dust settled on Redemption, but the whispers didn't. Elias' intervention, his silent defiance of their rush to judgment, had left a burr under the saddle of the town. It wasn't just the shame of nearly hanging an innocent woman. It was the unease of a stranger riding in, upsetting their precarious balance of power, and then vanishing like smoke. The whispers started low, in the shadowed corners of the saloon and the dusty back alleys. They questioned his motives, his sudden appearance, his wealth. Some muttered about him being a claim jumper, others a cattle rustler. Jedediah, nursing his bruised ego and empty pockets, fanned the flames of suspicion with tales of Elias cheating him at cards, of veiled threats and stolen glances at his claim. He painted Elias as a slick-talking con man, preying on the vulnerable, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Belle, now rebuilding her life on the small plot of land Elias had gifted her, felt the shift in the town's mood like a change in the wind. The apologies dried up, replaced by averted gazes and hushed conversations that ceased abruptly when she approached. The weight of their suspicion, their renewed distrust, pressed down on her, a constant reminder of her precarious position in this unforgiving town. Shed built a small cabin, sturdy and simple, with her own 2 hands. The land, though barren, held a promise of independence she hadn't dared to dream of before. She planted a small garden, coaxing life from the dry earth, each sprouting seedling a testament to her resilience. But the whispers, like a persistent drought, threatened to wither her newfound hope. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Silas, the barkeep, found her tending her garden. He leaned against the rough-hewn fence, his weathered face etched with concern. "Belle," he said, his voice low, "you should be careful." Belle straightened, her hands caked with dirt. "Careful of what, Silas?" "Of the talk," he replied, his gaze shifting towards the town. "Folks are saying Elias wasn't no saint, that he had his reasons for helping you." Belle's heart sank. She'd known the whispers were there, but hearing them voiced aloud by someone she'd come to trust was a blow. "They're saying he was in cahoots with Jedediah," Silas continued, "that they planned the whole thing to swindle the town." Belle shook her head, refusing to believe it. Elias' silent strength, the quiet dignity in his actions, didn't match the picture they were painting. "They're saying you were part of it too," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Belle felt a cold dread creep into her bones. The town, blinded by greed and suspicion, was turning on her again, twisting Elias' act of mercy into a conspiracy. "You gotta leave, Belle," Silas said, his voice urgent, before they decided to take matters into their own hands. Belle looked at her small cabin, at the fledgling garden, at the land that represented her hard-won freedom. The thought of leaving, of abandoning everything she'd built, filled her with despair. "Where would I go?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Doesn't matter," Silas replied. "Just get out of Redemption. Go somewhere they can't find you." That night, Belle lay awake, listening to the wind howl across the plains, the whispers of the town echoing in her mind. She knew Silas was right. Redemption, despite its name, offered her no salvation. She had to leave, had to disappear before the town's simmering resentment boiled over. Before dawn, while the town still slept, Belle packed a small bag, taking only what she could carry. She looked at her cabin, at the land that had briefly been hers, a pang of regret twisting in her gut. Then with a heavy heart she turned and walked away, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. She walked for days, following the faint trails etched into the dusty earth, the whispers of redemption fading with each step. She slept under the open sky, the vast expanse of stars, a comforting presence in the desolate landscape. She ate sparingly, the meager supplies in her bag dwindling with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she came across a small, isolated ranch nestled in a hidden valley. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life in the vast emptiness. Hesitantly, she approached, her heart pounding in her chest. A woman, her face weathered and kind, greeted her at the door. She saw the weariness in Belle's eyes, the dust of the road clinging to her clothes. "You look like you've traveled far," the woman said, her voice gentle. Belle nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "Come in, child," the woman said. "Rest and refresh yourself. You're safe here." Belle stepped inside, the warmth of the fire a welcome embrace. As she ate the simple meal the woman offered, she felt a flicker of hope rekindle in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, she could find peace in this hidden valley, a place far from the whispers of redemption, a place where she could finally start anew. The West remained wild, a land of hardship and uncertainty, but in the kindness of a stranger, Belle found a glimmer of hope, a promise of sanctuary in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The echoes of injustice still resonated, a constant hum beneath the surface, but here, in this quiet valley, they seemed a little less deafening, a little less threatening. The road ahead was still long, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Belle felt a sense of calm, a fragile peace settling over her weary soul. The woman, whose name was Martha, offered Belle a place to stay, a small room in the back of the ranch house. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry, a haven from the harsh realities of the outside world. Martha asked few questions, sensing the unspoken burden Belle carried. She offered instead quiet companionship and the solace of simple chores. Belle helped with the cooking, the cleaning, the tending of the small flock of chickens that scratched in the dusty yard. The rhythm of work, the quiet routine, was a balm to her frayed nerves. Days bled into weeks, the valley's isolation a shield against the whispers that had driven her from redemption. The fear that had gnawed at her began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. She rarely spoke of her past, the memories still too raw, too painful to unearth. But Martha, with her quiet wisdom and gentle understanding, didn't press. She seemed to know intuitively what Belle needed: time, space, and the quiet acceptance of another human being. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, Martha spoke of Elias. "Has been through a lot," she said, her voice soft. "Seen more hardship than most men twice his age." Belle's heart quickened. It was the first time Martha had mentioned him, the first time anyone in the valley had acknowledged his existence. "He's a good man," Martha continued, "but he carries his burdens heavy." Belle nodded, remembering the silent strength shed seen in his eyes, the flicker of defiance in the face of certain death. That flicker, she realized, wasn't just defiance, it was hope. Hope for her, hope for a world where justice, however fleeting, could still prevail. "He's out there now," Martha said, her gaze drifting towards the window, riding the fence line. Belle followed her gaze, her eyes scanning the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond the valley. She imagined him out there, alone under the vast star-studded sky, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the rugged mountains. A wave of longing, a strange mixture of gratitude and something akin to affection, washed over her. Later that night, sleep eluded Belle. The image of Elias, riding alone in the darkness, lingered in her mind. She rose from her bed, pulled on her boots, and quietly slipped out of the house. The night air was crisp and cool, the stars blazing like diamonds in the velvet sky. She followed a faint trail that led out of the valley, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know if she would find him, but something, some unseen force, drew her forward. After what seemed like hours, she saw a flicker of light in the distance. As she drew closer, she saw him. He sat by a small campfire, the flames illuminating his weathered face, the same broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. The black stallion grazed nearby, its coat gleaming in the firelight. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't gesture for her to join him, but he didn't turn her away either. Belle sat down opposite him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. The crackling of the fire, the gentle rustling of the wind in the trees, filled the void. Finally, Belle broke the silence. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "You didn't deserve what they did to you. Why did you help me?" Belle asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks. Elias looked at her, his eyes, usually hidden in shadow, now visible in the firelight. They were the color of the desert sky, vast and deep, filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "You reminded me of someone," he said, his voice low and rough. "Someone I couldn't save." He turned back to the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any further explanation, but Belle understood. She understood the weight of his burdens, the ghosts that haunted him, the silent promise he'd made to himself to protect those he could. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire slowly dying down, the stars wheeling overhead. Then Elias rose, his movements fluid and graceful. He saddled the black stallion, his actions deliberate, measured. He looked at Belle, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You're safe here," he said. "Martha will take care of you." Belle nodded, her heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She knew that this was goodbye, knew that their paths, however briefly intertwined, were now diverging. Elias mounted the stallion, the horse shifting restlessly beneath him. He looked at Belle one last time, a flicker of something akin to a smile touching his lips. Then, without a backward glance, he rode off into the darkness, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the west, leaving Belle alone under the silent stars, the echoes of his kindness resonating in the stillness of the night. The glimmer of hope he had ignited within her, however, burned brighter than ever, a beacon in the wilderness, guiding her towards a future she hadn't dared to imagine before. The West remained wild, unforgiving, but within its vastness, she had found a sanctuary, a fragile peace, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, capable of both great cruelty and profound compassion. The rhythmic creak of saddle leather was a lullaby Elias had known since boyhood. The steady gait of the black stallion, a comforting pulse beneath him, was the only rhythm that truly soothed the restless spirit within. He rode, not towards any particular destination, but away from the ghosts that nipped at his heels. Away from the memory of Belle's face, pale and etched with fear beneath the shadow of the gallows. Her fear had mirrored another's, a fear Head seen reflected in the eyes of a man Head called friend. He reined the stallion to a halt atop a windswept ridge, the vast expanse of the Texas plains stretching before him like a rumpled blanket. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, a stark reminder of the violence that stained this land, the violence he carried within him. He dismounted, the silence of the plains broken only by the sigh of the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. He built a small fire, the flames licking at the dry wood, casting flickering shadows that danced with the memories he couldn't escape. He saw Caleb's face, clear as day, framed by the noose, his eyes pleading, desperate. Caleb wrongly accused of rustling, a crime he hadn't committed, a crime orchestrated by a greedy rancher who coveted Caleb's small spread of land. Elias had tried to intervene, had presented evidence that proved Caleb's innocence, but the rancher, a man named Belle, had the sheriff in his pocket, the judge in his thrall. Justice, in that small, dust-choked town, was a commodity bought and sold like whiskey and women. Elias had watched, helpless, as Caleb swung from the gallows, the life choked out of him, the injustice burning a permanent scar onto Elias' soul. Head left that town, vowing never to witness such a travesty again. He drifted, a shadow in the vastness of the West, haunted by the memory of Caleb's death, the echo of his friend's last breath, a constant whisper in his ear. Head seen injustice in every town he passed through, the strong preying on the weak, the greedy exploiting the vulnerable. Had intervened when he could quietly, anonymously, righting wrongs where he found them, a silent guardian angel dispensing his own brand of frontier justice. Had seen Belle's plight reflected in the dusty windows of the Redemption Saloon, the fear in her eyes mirroring Caleb's. Had seen Jedediah's greed, the sheriff's complicity, the town's eagerness to condemn. Had known, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he didn't intervene, Belle would become another ghost to haunt his already crowded past. Had tracked down the real culprits, two drifters passing through, desperate for money. Had retrieved the stolen gold, the proof of Belle's innocence, and delivered it to the sheriff, arriving just in the nick of time. He hadn't stayed to witness the aftermath, hadn't needed to see the shame in the townsfolk's eyes, the relief in Belle's. Had simply ridden away, disappearing into the shimmering heat of the desert, leaving the whispers and the reckoning behind. He took a swig from his canteen, the cool water a temporary balm against the burning memories. He looked up at the stars, the vastness of the night sky a stark contrast to the confines of his own troubled mind. He wondered if Caleb could see him, if he knew that Elias hadn't forgotten, that he was still fighting his fight, still seeking justice for those who couldn't seek it for themselves. He thought of Belle, safe now in Martha's care, given a second chance at life, a chance had been unable to give Caleb. He hoped she would find peace in that quiet valley, hoped she would be able to rebuild her life, free from the shadows of the past. He rose, his joints stiff from the long ride, the cold seeping into his bones. He saddled the stallion, the familiar routine a grounding force in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. He mounted, the horse shifting beneath him, eager to be on the move. He looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, the darkness stretching before him, an endless horizon of possibility and uncertainty. He didn't know where he was going, didn't have a destination in mind, but he knew he had to keep moving, had to keep riding, had to keep the ghosts at bay. He was a wanderer, a shadow in the wilderness, a silent guardian angel dispensing his own brand of justice in a land where justice was often a fleeting illusion. He touched the brim of his hat, a silent salute to the rising sun, and rode on into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West, carrying his burdens, his memories, and his unwavering commitment to justice. A solitary figure against the backdrop of a world still steeped in shadows. The valley, nestled deep within the folds of the Montana Territory, had offered Belle a fragile peace, a sanctuary from the storm that had raged in redemption. But the quiet rhythm of her days, the solace of simple chores, couldn't entirely quell the gnawing unease that still lingered in her heart. The whispers of redemption, the distant, still echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the injustice Shed endured, the fragility of her newfound peace. Martha, with her quiet wisdom and unwavering kindness, had become a lifeline, a surrogate mother in this isolated haven. Yet Belle couldn't shake the feeling that she was living on borrowed time, that the shadows of the past would eventually find her, no matter how remote her refuge. She yearned for true redemption, not the hollow promise offered by the town that bore its name, but the kind born of proven innocence, the kind that would silence the whispers once and for all. One crisp autumn morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Belle's heart quickened, a premonition tightening in her chest. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the distinctive gait of Elias' black stallion, the broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. Hope, fierce and unexpected, surged through her. He dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, the same quiet strength she remembered radiating from him. He looked at her, his gaze steady, unwavering, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience that bound them together. "They're coming for you, Belle," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the words hanging heavy in the still morning air. Belle's fragile peace shattered, the whispers of redemption suddenly amplified, no longer distant echoes but a tangible threat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. "But how?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing." "Jedediah," Elias replied, the name a curse on his lips. "He's convinced them you were in on it, that you and I conspired to cheat the town." Belle's mind raced. Jedediah, fueled by vengeance and greed, had woven a web of lies, twisting Elias' act of mercy into a criminal conspiracy. The town, blinded by their own prejudices and eager for a scapegoat, had swallowed his lies whole. "They're forming a posse," Elias continued, his gaze scanning the horizon. "Heading this way." Desperation clawed at Belle's throat. Shed found sanctuary in this valley, a fragile piece Shed cherished. But now it was threatened, about to be ripped away by the same forces that had driven her from redemption. She looked at Elias, the silent strength in his presence, her only anchor in the rising tide of fear. "You have to believe me," she pleaded, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. "I had nothing to do with it. I swear it." Elias nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I know," he said, the two words a lifeline in the storm of her fear. A flicker of hope rekindled in Belle's heart. Elias believed her, and in that belief, she found the strength to fight, to reclaim her innocence, to silence the whispers that threatened to consume her. "We have to leave," Elias said, his voice urgent. Belle hesitated, her gaze lingering on the small cabin, the fledgling garden, the symbols of the life shed painstakingly built in this valley. The thought of abandoning it, of being driven from yet another sanctuary, filled her with despair. "There's no time," Elias said, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. "They'll be here soon." Belle took a deep breath, steeling herself against the rising panic. She looked at Elias, his presence a beacon of strength in the gathering darkness. He believed her, and that was all that mattered. She would fight. She would clear her name. She would find true redemption, not in the hollow promises of a town, but in the unwavering belief of the silent rancher who had twice saved her from the gallows. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm, the fear receding, replaced by a newfound resolve. Elias nodded, his eyes reflecting the same steely determination. He helped her onto the black stallion, his touch firm, reassuring. Then, with a final glance at the valley, the sanctuary that had briefly been hers, they rode off, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the west, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. The whispers of redemption fading in the distance, replaced by the rhythmic beat of hooves on the dusty trail, the steady rhythm of hope against the backdrop of a world still steeped in shadows. They rode hard, pushing the black stallion to its limits, the vast expanse of the Montana plains stretching before them, an endless horizon of possibility and uncertainty. Belle, clinging to Elias' back, felt the wind whipping through her hair, the vastness of the landscape a stark contrast to the confines of her fear. They were running, not from justice, but towards it, seeking refuge not in isolation, but in the truth. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the landscape in hues of gold and ochre, Elias reined the stallion to a halt. They were atop a wind-swept ridge, the plains stretching before them like a rumpled blanket, the distant peaks of the mountains a jagged silhouette against the horizon. "We need a plan," Belle said, her voice catching in the dry air. Elias nodded, his gaze scanning the horizon. "We head north," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "to Fort Benton. There's a judge there, a man named Holden. Is known for his fairness, his unwillingness to bend to pressure." Belle's heart lifted. Fort Benton, a bustling hub of trade and commerce, a place where the law, however tenuous, still held sway. Judge Holden, a beacon of hope in a land often governed by greed and prejudice. Maybe, just maybe, they could find justice there, could finally silence the whispers that had followed her from redemption. "But Jedediah," Belle began, her voice laced with apprehension. "He won't give up easily," Elias said, his eyes narrowing, a steely glint in their depths. "But well, be ready for him." He looked at Belle, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Well, get through this, Belle," he said, the quiet assurance in his voice a balm to her frayed nerves. "I promise you." Belle nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. She looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, the endless horizon a symbol of the unknown future that lay ahead. The road to Fort Benton was long, the challenges daunting, but with Elias by her side, she knew she could face them, could fight for the justice she deserved, could finally find true redemption in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West. The sun beat down on the dusty trail, baking the earth to a hard, unforgiving crust. The rhythmic thud of the stallion's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, the only sounds in the vast emptiness of the plains. They rode for days, north towards Fort Benton, the distant peaks of the mountains, a constant reminder of the journey's length, the challenges that lay ahead. They spoke little, the silence between them a comfortable companion, a shared understanding of the unspoken fears and hopes that bound them together. Elias, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind working, piecing together the fragments of Jedediah's deceit. He knew the man, knew his greed, his vindictiveness, his willingness to bend the truth to his own advantage. Had seen it before in other towns, other faces, the same pattern of exploitation and injustice repeating itself across the vast landscape of the West. He knew Jedediah wouldn't stop until he had Belle hanging from the gallows, until Head claimed her land, her livelihood, her very life. Head started his investigation the moment they'd left Martha's Valley, quietly questioning travelers they met along the trail, piecing together Jedediah's movements, his alliances, his motives. Head learned that Jedediah had spread his lies far and wide, painting Belle as a conniving thief, himself as a wronged victim, a champion of justice seeking retribution for the town of redemption. Head even enlisted the help of a shifty-eyed prospector named Jed, a man known for his loose tongue and his eagerness to spread rumors for a few coins. Jed, Elias knew, was the key to unraveling Jedediah's web of deceit. He was the one who had planted the seeds of suspicion in the minds of the townsfolk, the one who had fueled the flames of their prejudice, the one who had ultimately turned them against Belle. He was the weak link in Jedediah's chain, the one who, with the right persuasion, might be willing to reveal the truth. They found Jed holed up in a dilapidated saloon in a small dust-choked town a few days' ride south of Fort Benton. The saloon, its windows boarded up, its doors hanging askew, reeked of stale beer and desperation. Inside, a handful of patrons huddled in the dim light, their faces etched with the weariness of hard living, their eyes reflecting the bleakness of their existence. Elias, leaving Belle outside with the stallion, stepped into the gloom, his presence immediately silencing the low murmur of conversation. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on a figure slumped in a corner booth, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. He approached the booth, his movements deliberate, measured, the quiet strength he possessed radiating from him like heat from a forge. Jed looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face unshaven, his clothes stained with the grime of the trail. He recognized Elias, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "You," he mumbled, his voice slurred, his words thick with alcohol. "What do you want?" Elias sat down opposite him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. He looked at Jed, his gaze steady, unwavering, the weight of his presence bearing down on the prospector like a physical force. "I know you lied about Belle," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly, the words hanging in the air like gunshots. Jed flinched, his eyes darting around the room, seeking an escape route that wasn't there. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Elias leaned closer, his gaze boring into Jed's, the intensity of his stare unnerving. "Jedediah paid you to spread those lies," he said, his voice soft, menacing. "He promised you a share of her land, didn't he?" Jed's resolve crumbled, the fear in his eyes now palpable. He knew he couldn't lie to Elias, couldn't escape the silent judgment in his gaze. He looked down at the bottle in his hand, his fingers trembling. He said it would be easy," Jed stammered, his voice barely audible. "Said nobody would believe her, that she was already an outsider, a fallen woman." Elias' jaw tightened, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew the power of prejudice, the ease with which it could turn a community against an innocent person. Had seen it too many times, the same pattern of injustice repeating itself across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. "Tell me everything," Elias said, his voice still soft, but laced with a steely edge. "Tell me how Jedediah manipulated you, how he orchestrated Belle's downfall." Jed, his spirit broken, his fear overwhelming him. Spilled everything? He recounted how Jedediah had approached him, how he had offered him money and a share of Belle's land in exchange for spreading lies about her, how Head painted her as a thief, a conspirator, a threat to the town of redemption. He described how Head planted the seeds of suspicion in the minds of the townsfolk, how Head fueled the flames of their prejudice, how He'd ultimately turned them against Belle. Elias listened, his face impassive, his mind absorbing every detail, every lie, every act of betrayal. He knew what he had to do, knew how he could use Jed's confession to clear Belle's name, to expose Jedediah's deceit, to bring justice to the town of redemption. He had the evidence he needed, the key to unlocking the truth, the weapon he needed to fight the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He rose, his movements fluid and graceful, the quiet strength he possessed radiating from him like a beacon in the dim light of the saloon. He looked down at Jed, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You've made a grave mistake, Jed," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the words a chilling pronouncement of judgment. "But you can still redeem yourself." He turned and walked out of the saloon, stepping back into the bright sunlight, the vastness of the plains stretching before him, an endless horizon of possibility and uncertainty. He knew the road to Fort Benton was still long, the challenges still daunting, but he also knew that he had the truth on his side, the power to right the wrongs, the strength to bring justice to those who had been unjustly condemned. He looked towards the mountains, their peaks a distant promise of redemption, and with a newfound resolve, he mounted the black stallion, Belle by his side, and rode on into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West, carrying the weight of his burdens, the hope of justice, and the unwavering belief in the power of truth to conquer the shadows. He didn't ride straight for Fort Benton. Something about Jed's confession gnawed at him, a sliver of doubt lodged like a splinter in his mind. The prospector's fear had been genuine, his remorse palpable. But his story, while damning to Jedediah, lacked a certain weight. It explained the how, but not the why. Why would Jedediah go to such lengths to frame Belle? Her small parcel of land, while fertile, wasn't worth the risk, the effort, the sheer malice involved. There had to be more to it. He and Belle found a sheltered hollow amidst a cluster of red rock formations, a temporary refuge from the relentless sun. He unsaddled the stallion, letting it graze on the sparse vegetation, while Belle built a small fire, the flames licking at the dry wood, casting flickering shadows that danced with the uncertainty swirling within him. "Something's not right," he said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Belle looked up, her face etched with weariness, her eyes mirroring the doubt in his own. "What do you mean?" she asked. He recounted Jed's confession, the details of Jedediah's scheme, the prospector's fear, his remorse. "It all fits," he said, his voice laced with a quiet frustration. "But it doesn't explain the motive. Jedediah's a greedy man, but is not stupid. This is personal." Belle's brow furrowed, her mind racing, searching for an answer that eluded her. Maybe it's not about the land," she said, her voice hesitant. "Maybe it's about me." Elias considered her words, turning them over in his mind, searching for a connection, a hidden motive that explained Jedediah's obsessive pursuit of her ruin. He thought back to their first encounter in redemption, the way Jedediah had looked at her, the mixture of greed and something else. Resentment? Envy. He couldn't quite place it. "There's something we're missing," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "Something important." He rose, his gaze drawn to the vast expanse of the plains stretching before them, the endless horizon a symbol of the unknown, the unanswered questions that lingered in the air. He knew he couldn't continue to Fort Benton until he understood Jedediah's true motive, until he uncovered the missing piece of the puzzle. He had to go back, had to retrace his steps, had to delve deeper into the shadows that clung to redemption. "We need to talk to Martha," he said, his voice firm, his mind made up. Belle's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding dawning in their depths. Martha, with her quiet wisdom, her deep knowledge of the town and its inhabitants, might hold the key to unlocking the mystery that surrounded Jedediah's vendetta against Belle. They saddled the stallion, the familiar routine a grounding force in the swirling uncertainty of their situation. They rode south, back towards the valley, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, the whispers of redemption beckoning them back into the heart of the darkness. They reached Martha's Valley under the cloak of a starlit night, the familiar landscape a welcome sight after the long, arduous journey. Martha, her face etched with worry, greeted them at the door, her eyes searching theirs, seeking answers to the unspoken questions that hung heavy in the air. They sat around the small kitchen table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Elias recounted their encounter with Jed, the prospector's confession, the lingering questions about Jedediah's motive. Martha listened intently, her eyes narrowed, her mind working, piecing together the fragments of information. When Elias finished, she sighed, a deep, weary sound that echoed the weight of the secrets she carried. "Jedediah's always been a man consumed by envy," she said, her voice low, thoughtful. "He coveted everything his brother had, his land, his success, his family." Elias' mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Jedediah's brother, Belle's husband, the land head left behind. "Belle's husband," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "He was Jedediah's brother?" Martha nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. "They were estranged," she said, her voice laced with sadness. "A falling out over. Well, it doesn't matter now. What matters is that Jedediah never forgave his brother for having what he didn't." The truth, stark and brutal, settled upon them like a shroud. Jedediah's vendetta against Belle wasn't about land. It was about revenge, a twisted, obsessive desire to punish her for the perceived sins of his brother, for the life Head never had. Head framed her, not for her land, but for her connection to the brother Head hated, the brother who had everything Head ever desired. The silence in the small kitchen was heavy, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a physical burden. Belle, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, stared into the flickering lamplight, the truth a bitter pill to swallow. Elias, his gaze fixed on Belle, saw the pain in her eyes, the realization that the injustice Shed endured was rooted not in greed, but in a deep, festering resentment that had nothing to do with her, a resentment that had been brewing long before Shed ever set foot in redemption. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, the warmth of his touch a silent reassurance in the face of the harsh truth. He knew what he had to do, knew how he could use this newfound knowledge to clear Belle's name, to expose Jedediah's true motive, to finally bring justice to the town of redemption. He looked at Martha, his gaze steady, unwavering. "We ride for Fort Benton," he said, his voice firm, his mind made up. "It's time to end this." He knew the road to Fort Benton wouldn't be easy. Jedediah, fueled by his twisted vendetta, wouldn't give up without a fight. And now, with the added complication of Ezekiel's involvement, the path to justice seemed fraught with even greater peril. He looked at Belle, her face etched with a mixture of weariness and resolve. Shed endured so much, lost so much, yet her spirit remained unbroken, a testament to her resilience, her unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption. "Well, need help," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. Martha nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. "There are others who have suffered under Jedediah and Ezekiel's tyranny," she said, her voice laced with a quiet anger. "They may be willing to help, but they'll be afraid." Elias understood. Fear was a powerful weapon, a tool used by men like Jedediah and Ezekiel to maintain their control, to silence dissent, to perpetuate their reign of injustice. He knew he had to find a way to overcome that fear, to rally those who had been wronged, to unite them against a common enemy. "Well, start with Caleb," Martha said, her voice firm, a glint of steel in her eyes. "As a blacksmith, a good man. But he's been struggling ever since Jedediah drove him out of business." Caleb's forge, located on the outskirts of Redemption, was cold and silent, the tools of his trade hanging unused on the walls, covered in a thin layer of dust. Caleb, his face lined with worry, his hands calloused from years of hard work, greeted them with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He listened intently as Elias laid out his plan, the details of Jedediah and Ezekiel's conspiracy. The evidence had gathered, the need for witnesses to testify against them in Fort Benton. When Elias finished, Caleb sighed, a deep, weary sound that echoed the weight of his own struggles. "I want to help, Elias," he said, his voice laced with a quiet frustration. "But I've got a family to think about. Jedediah is a dangerous man. He could ruin me." Elias understood Caleb's fear, the precarious balance between survival and justice, in a land where the law was often a distant whisper. He looked at Caleb, his gaze steady, unwavering. "We all have something to lose, Caleb," he said, his voice low, intense. "But we also have something to gain. Justice. A chance to reclaim what's been taken from us. A chance to build a better future for our children." Caleb's eyes met Elias, a flicker of determination igniting in their depths. He thought of his children, their future uncertain in a town ruled by greed and corruption. He thought of the injustice had endured, the helplessness had felt, the gnawing sense of despair that had settled upon him like a shroud. He looked at Elias, at Belle, at Martha, their faces etched with a shared determination, a shared belief in the possibility of redemption. He knew he couldn't stand by and watch while Jedediah and Ezekiel continued to prey on the weak, to corrupt the town, to steal the future from his children. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the fear that still lingered in his heart. He looked at Elias, his gaze firm, unwavering. "I'm in," he said, his voice strong, resolute. With Caleb on board, Elias and Belle, guided by Martha's wisdom, sought out others who had suffered under Jedediah and Ezekiel's tyranny. They spoke to Sarah, a widowed shopkeeper whose business had been driven into the ground by Ezekiel's exorbitant taxes. They spoke to Thomas, a rancher whose land had been stolen by Jedediah through fraudulent claims. They spoke to Abigail, a young woman whose family had been forced to flee redemption after Jedediah had falsely accused her father of theft. Each of them had their own story of injustice, their own reasons for wanting to see Jedediah and Ezekiel brought to justice. Each of them, initially hesitant, eventually agreed to join Elias and Belle on their journey to Fort Benton, their fear overcome by a shared desire for justice, a shared belief in the possibility of redemption. As the group grew, so did Elias' understanding of the extent of Jedediah and Ezekiel's corruption. He learned how they had manipulated the town's finances, how they had used their positions of power to enrich themselves at the expense of others, how they had created a climate of fear and intimidation that had silenced dissent and allowed them to operate with impunity. He also learned of their hidden alliances, the network of corrupt officials and shady businessmen who had benefited from their schemes, who had helped them maintain their grip on redemption. He realized that Jedediah and Ezekiel were not just individuals, but symptoms of a deeper malaise, a systemic corruption that had infected the very heart of the town. The journey to Fort Benton was long and arduous. The challenges they faced numerous and daunting. They encountered hostile terrain, dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of pursuit by Jedediah's men. But their resolve remained unbroken, their spirits buoyed by their shared purpose, their unwavering belief in the possibility of justice. They traveled by night, seeking shelter during the day, relying on the kindness of strangers, the quiet network of support that existed beneath the surface of the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the West. As they drew closer to Fort Benton, Elias knew that the final confrontation with Jedediah and Ezekiel was inevitable. He knew that the battle for redemption would be fought not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of the people who had been wronged, the people who had been silenced, the people who had been robbed of their future. He looked at Belle, her face etched with a mixture of weariness and determination, her eyes reflecting the fire that burned within her, the unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption. He knew that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, could fight for the justice they deserved, could finally bring light to the shadows that had haunted redemption for so long. The outskirts of Fort Benton huddled under a bruised sky, the air thick with the promise of rain. Elias and Belle, along with their small band of witnesses, found refuge in a weathered livery stable on the edge of town. The horses, restless and snorting, sensed the coming storm, mirroring the tension that crackled amongst the humans. Caleb, his face grim, sharpened his tools, the rhythmic clang, a metallic heartbeat in the quiet stable. Sarah, her hands clasped tight, murmured a silent prayer. Thomas paced restlessly, his boots scuffing against the hay-strewn floor. Abigail, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination, clung to her mother's arm. Martha, a pillar of quiet strength, sat on an overturned bucket, her gaze fixed on the distant lights of Fort Benton, her mind working, strategizing. Elias, his face impassive, cleaned his rifle, the oiled cloth moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Had sent word to Ezekiel, requesting a meeting. A dangerous gamble, but a necessary one. He needed to confront Ezekiel, to gauge his reaction, to see if the man could be broken, or if he'd fight to the bitter end. The wait was agonizing. Every creak of the stable door, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of anticipation through the small group. Finally, just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, a figure emerged from the gloom, silhouetted against the flickering gaslight of the street. Ezekiel. He entered the stable, his eyes scanning the faces that watched him, a sneer curling his lip. "You sent for me, Elias," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "What do you want?" Elias rose, his movements fluid and graceful, the quiet strength he possessed radiating from him like a beacon in the dim light of the stable. He met Ezekiel's gaze, his own steady, unwavering. "I have evidence, Ezekiel," Elias said, his voice low and gravelly, the words hanging in the air like gunshots. "Evidence of your crimes, your corruption, your conspiracy with Jedediah." Ezekiel's sneer faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Had underestimated Elias, dismissed him as a harmless drifter. He hadn't anticipated this, the quiet, relentless pursuit, the gathering storm of witnesses ready to testify against him. "You have nothing," Ezekiel blustered, trying to regain his composure. "Just the ramblings of a disgruntled woman and a handful of malcontents." Elias stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, the tension in the air thickening. He held up a small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Ezekiel's meticulous records of his illicit dealings, his bribes, his extortions, his carefully orchestrated schemes to bleed redemption dry. "This says otherwise," Elias said, his voice soft, menacing. He opened the ledger, the pages rustling in the silence of the stable, the ink a stark testament to Ezekiel's greed and corruption. He pointed to a specific entry, a record of a large sum of money transferred from the town's coffers to Ezekiel's personal account. "Explain this," he said, his gaze boring into Ezekiel's. Ezekiel's face paled, the blood draining from his cheeks. He'd been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. He couldn't understand how Elias had obtained this ledger, this damning piece of evidence that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed empire. Where did you get that?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Elias didn't answer. He simply turned a few more pages, revealing further evidence of Ezekiel's corruption, his collusion with Jedediah, their systematic plundering of redemption. With each turned page, Ezekiel's composure crumbled, the fear in his eyes growing, the arrogance replaced by a desperate plea for mercy. You can't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. I have powerful friends. They'll destroy you." Elias remained silent, his gaze steady, unwavering. He knew the risks, the dangers he faced in challenging men like Ezekiel and Jedediah. But he also knew that he couldn't back down, couldn't allow them to continue their reign of terror, couldn't betray the trust of those who had risked everything to stand with him. He closed the ledger, the sound echoing in the silence of the stable, a final pronouncement of judgment. He looked at Ezekiel, his gaze cold, unforgiving. "Your reign of terror ends here, Ezekiel," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The words a chilling pronouncement of doom. "You and Jedediah will face justice in Fort Benton. The people of redemption will finally have their say." Ezekiel, his spirit broken, his defiance gone, could only nod, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. He knew he'd been beaten, outmaneuvered, exposed. Had underestimated Elias, the quiet, relentless force of justice that had pursued him, tracked him down, and finally brought him to his knees. The rain continued to fall, the steady drumming on the stable roof a somber soundtrack to Ezekiel's defeat. Elias watched as he stumbled out of the stable, his figure disappearing into the gloom. A broken man, his empire crumbling around him. He turned to the small group of witnesses, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice low, intense. "Jedediah will fight. He'll be desperate. We need to be ready." They nodded, their resolve strengthened by Ezekiel's downfall, their belief in the possibility of justice renewed. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that Jedediah would be a formidable opponent, but they also knew that they had the truth on their side, the power of their collective voices, the unwavering determination to fight for the redemption of their town. The storm raged outside, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the walls of the stable. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, a storm of hope, of defiance, of the unwavering belief in the power of justice to conquer the shadows. They huddled together, a small band of rebels united against a common enemy, their faces illuminated by the flickering gaslight, their eyes reflecting the fire that burned within them, the unwavering belief in the possibility of a new dawn for redemption. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose, a belief that even in the darkest of times, justice could prevail. And in the quiet strength of Elias, they found the courage to face the coming storm, to fight for the future they deserved, to finally bring light to the shadows that had haunted their town for so long. The rain hammered the tin roof of the livery, a relentless rhythm echoing the tension inside. Ezekiel's confession, or rather his collapse, had been a victory, but a fragile one. Elias knew Jedediah wouldn't go down easy. The man was like a cornered rattlesnake, coiled tight, ready to strike. He paced the length of the stable, the scent of damp hay and nervous horses filling the air. Belle sat quietly beside Martha, her face pale but resolute. The others huddled together, their whispers hushed, their eyes darting towards Elias, seeking reassurance he couldn't offer. He had a plan, a risky one, but it was all they had left. He needed to get Belle and the others safely to the courthouse in Fort Benton. He needed to buy them time. A sudden sharp crack echoed from outside, followed by the shattering of glass. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his Colt peacemaker. "Get down!" he barked, shoving Belle and Martha towards the relative safety of the stalls. The stable doors burst open, revealing 3 shadowy figures silhouetted against the stormy night. Ezekiel's men, gaunt. They moved quickly, their rifles raised, their faces grim, determined. The stale air exploded with the roar of gunfire. Elias returned fire, his shots precise, measured, each one aimed to disable, not to kill. He wasn't a killer, but he would defend himself. Defend those who had put their trust in him. Caleb grabbed a pitchfork, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. Thomas, his eyes narrowed, grabbed a shovel, his large frame a formidable presence. Even Sarah, her face pale but resolute, armed herself with a broken bottle, ready to fight for her survival, for the hope of justice. The fight was brutal, close quarters, a chaotic dance of shadows and gunfire in the confined space of the stable. Elias, moving with a quiet grace born of years spent in the wilderness, managed to disarm one of the attackers, sending him sprawling to the ground. Caleb, wielding the pitchfork with surprising ferocity, managed to hold off another, his grunts of exertion echoing in the chaotic din. But the third man, a wiry, ruthless individual with a cold glint in his eye, pressed his attack, his rifle spitting fire, forcing Elias to take cover behind a stack of hay bales. Belle, watching the fight unfold, felt a wave of terror wash over her. She had seen enough violence in her life, enough death to last a lifetime. But this was different. This was for her, for the future of redemption. She couldn't stand by and watch while Elias and the others risked their lives for her. She grabbed a lantern, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the stable walls. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she hurled it towards the attacker who was pressing Elias, the glass shattering, the oil igniting, engulfing the man in a sudden burst of flames. He screamed in agony, his rifle clattering to the ground, his body writhing in the firelight. The distraction gave Elias the opening he needed. He emerged from behind the hay bales, his Colt raised, his gaze fixed on the remaining attacker. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice cold, hard. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Elias and the burning figure of his companion. He knew he was beaten, outnumbered, outgunned. He slowly lowered his rifle, his face a mask of defeat. The fight was over, but the tension remained, thick and heavy in the air. The stable was a wreck, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning flesh. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood and the grime, cleansing the space, preparing it for a new beginning. Elias, his face grim, surveyed the scene. One of Ezekiel's men lay dead, consumed by the flames. The other 2 were subdued, their hands bound, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. He looked at Belle, her face pale but resolute, her eyes shining with a newfound strength. He knew they couldn't stay here, couldn't risk another attack. They had to get to Fort Benton, had to present their evidence, had to expose Jedediah and Ezekiel's crimes to the light of day. "We ride," he said, his voice low, intense. They saddled their horses, the familiar routine a grounding force in the swirling chaos of their situation. They rode out of the stable, into the stormy night, the rain washing away the dust and the grime, cleansing them, preparing them for the final battle. The road to Fort Benton lay ahead, a path fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they rode with a renewed sense of purpose, a shared determination to fight for the justice they deserved, to finally bring light to the shadows that had haunted redemption for so long. The storm raged around them, a reflection of the turmoil within their hearts. But they rode on, undeterred, their eyes fixed on the distant lights of Fort Benton, the beacon of hope that beckoned them forward, promising a new dawn, a chance for redemption. They rode hard, the storm a swirling curtain around them, obscuring the landscape, blurring the boundaries between earth and sky. The horses, sensing the urgency, their flanks lathered with sweat, pushed on, their hooves drumming a relentless rhythm against the rain-soaked earth. Elias, his face grim, set the pace, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of pursuit. He knew Jedediah wouldn't let them escape without a fight. The storm began to ease as they approached the outskirts of Fort Benton, the clouds parting to reveal a bruised sunset-streaked sky. The town, nestled in the valley, seemed a haven of peace, a stark contrast to the wildness of the surrounding landscape. But Elias knew that peace was an illusion, a fragile veneer masking the corruption that festered beneath the surface. They reached a deserted homestead, its weathered timbers a stark silhouette against the fiery backdrop of the setting sun. "Well, rest here," Elias said, his voice low, weary. "We need to be ready for what comes next." They dismounted, their bodies stiff and aching from the long ride. Martha, ever practical, began tending to the horses, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. Caleb and Thomas, their faces grim, set about securing the perimeter, their movements betraying the tension that coiled within them. Sarah and Abigail huddled together, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Belle, her face pale but resolute, sat beside Elias, her hand resting on his arm, drawing strength from his quiet presence. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the air. Gunfire. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his Colt. "Get down," he barked, shoving Belle towards the relative safety of the dilapidated homestead. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms silhouetted against the twilight sky. Jedediah's men. They fanned out, their rifles raised, their movements precise, coordinated. They'd been waiting for them, anticipating their arrival. The fight began, the stillness of the evening shattered by the roar of gunfire. Elias, moving with a fluid grace born of years spent in the wilderness, returned fire, his shots precise, measured, each one aimed to disable, not to kill. He wasn't a killer, but he would defend himself, defend those who had put their trust in him. Caleb and Thomas, armed with their makeshift weapons, joined the fight, their faces grim, determined. Even Sarah, her fear overcome by a surge of adrenaline, picked up a fallen branch, using it to fend off an attacker who got too close. Abigail, her eyes wide with terror, huddled behind a crumbling wall, her hands clasped tight, praying for their survival. Belle, watching the fight unfold, felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She wanted to help, to fight alongside Elias, but she knew she'd be a liability, a target for Jedediah's men. She could only watch, her heart pounding in her chest, as the fight raged around her, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid tang of fear. The attackers pressed their advantage, their numbers overwhelming the small band of defenders. Elias, his face grim, realized they were outmatched, outgunned. They couldn't win this fight. They needed to escape, to regroup, to find another way to bring Jedediah to justice. "Belle!" he yelled, his voice barely audible above the din of gunfire. "Get the horses. We have to go." Belle, her eyes meeting his, understood. She scrambled to her feet, dodging bullets, her movements fueled by a desperate courage. She reached the horses, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. She managed to calm them, to soothe their frayed nerves, her hands moving with a gentle firmness that belied the chaos raging around her. Elias, covering her retreat, fired a final shot, his aim precise, hitting the lantern that one of the attackers held, sending a shower of sparks and flames into the night. The sudden burst of light momentarily blinded the attackers, giving Belle the opportunity she needed. She mounted her horse, urging it forward, leading the others towards the cover of the trees, their hooves pounding against the earth, a desperate rhythm echoing the frantic beat of her heart. Elias, seeing that Belle and the others had escaped, turned and ran, his movements swift and silent, melting into the shadows, disappearing into the night. He knew Jedediah's men would pursue him, but he also knew the terrain, the hidden trails and gullies that crisscrossed the landscape. He would use that knowledge to his advantage, to evade his pursuers, to buy himself time, to regroup, to plan his next move. The gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the mournful cry of a coyote, a haunting sound that echoed the desolation of the landscape, the fragility of hope in a land where violence and injustice often held sway. But even in the darkest of times, a spark of hope remained, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Elias, alone in the wilderness, his heart filled with a quiet rage, knew he wouldn't give up, wouldn't rest until Jedediah was brought to justice, until Belle and the others were safe, until redemption was finally redeemed. The fight was far from over, but the first battle had been won. Belle and the witnesses were safe, on their way to Fort Benton, carrying with them the evidence that could finally bring Jedediah and Ezekiel's reign of terror to an end. And in the quiet strength of Elias, in his unwavering determination, lay the promise of a new dawn, a chance for redemption, a glimmer of hope in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West. The rain had stopped, leaving the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. Fort Benton's muddy streets shimmered under a nascent moon, reflecting the gaslights that flickered like fireflies trapped in jars. Belle and the others had reached the town just before dawn, bone-tired but driven by a fierce, shared purpose. They'd found refuge with a sympathetic sheriff, a man weary of Jedediah's long shadow, a man hungry for justice. Martha, her face etched with exhaustion, had taken Abigail and Sarah to a small boarding house, a place of temporary sanctuary, while Caleb and Thomas remained with the sheriff, their testimonies bolstering Belle's account. Weaving a tapestry of corruption that implicated not just Jedediah, but Ezekiel, too. Belle, however, couldn't rest. She paced the sheriff's office, the floorboards creaking beneath her restless boots, her mind racing. Where was Elias? Had he escaped Jedediah's men? She had seen him disappear into the darkness, a ghost swallowed by the night. She prayed he was alive, that he would find his way to them, that they could face this final hurdle together. The sheriff, a man named Brody, watched her with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. Had seen enough hardship in his years to recognize the steel in her gaze, the quiet strength that radiated from her, despite the ordeal she had endured. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He'll be all right, Mom," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Elias is a survivor. He'll find his way." Just as he spoke, A figure emerged from the swirling mist that clung to the streets. Elias. He stood in the doorway, his clothes torn, his face bruised, but his eyes burning with a familiar intensity. Belle rushed towards him, relief washing over her like a cleansing rain. He met her gaze, a flicker of warmth softening his hardened features. "You made it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his hand reaching out to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "We finished this," he said, his voice low gravelly. "Together." With Elias' arrival, the pieces began to fall into place. His knowledge of the terrain, his tracking skills, had allowed him to evade Jedediah's men. Had even managed to acquire further evidence of their crimes, a hidden cache of documents that detailed their illicit dealings, their systematic plundering of redemption. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Ezekiel, his arrogance shattered, his empire crumbling around him, confessed his crimes, implicating Jedediah in the process. The townsfolk, emboldened by Belle's courage and Elias' unwavering pursuit of justice, poured into the courtroom, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation, their presence a testament to the power of unity against tyranny. Jedediah, cornered, his power stripped away, his reputation in tatters, tried to deny the accusations, to bluster his way out of the situation. But the evidence was too strong, the testimonies too compelling. He was found guilty, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The news spread like wildfire through redemption. The town, once shrouded in fear and despair, erupted in celebration. The people, freed from the yoke of oppression, danced in the streets, their laughter echoing through the valley, a joyous symphony of liberation. Belle, watching the celebrations from the steps of the courthouse, felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. The nightmare was finally over. Her name was cleared, her husband's memory honored, her town redeemed. She turned to Elias, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, sincere. "I couldn't have done it without you." He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the quiet strength that had sustained her through the darkest of times. He didn't speak, but his presence, his unwavering support, spoke volumes. Had given her more than just justice, had given her back her faith in humanity, her belief in the possibility of a better future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of hope and renewal, Belle and Elias stood together, silhouetted against the fading light, their figures a symbol of resilience, of the quiet strength that can bloom even in the harshest of landscape. The West remained wild, untamed, but in the heart of redemption, a small seed of mercy had been planted, a testament to the enduring power of justice, the unwavering spirit of those who dared to stand up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And in the shared silence between Belle and Elias, a new chapter began, a chapter filled with the promise of healing, of rebuilding, of finding solace and strength in the shared experience of surviving the storm. Surviving the storm. The future remained uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges, but they would face it together, their spirits forged in the crucible of adversity, their hearts filled with a quiet hope, a belief in the possibility of a new dawn, a new beginning in the heart of the wild, untamed West. The weeks that followed the trial were a blur of activity. Redemption, like a dry sponge thrown into a bucket, soaked up the relief. Folks started rebuilding, patching roofs, mending fences, their movements imbued with a renewed sense of purpose. The general store, once a symbol of Jedediah's oppressive control, was reopened under new management, its shelves stocked with goods brought in by honest traders. The laughter of children, once a rarity, now echoed through the streets, a testament to the town's rebirth. Belle, her name cleared, found herself at the center of it all. She wasn't seeking leadership, but it found her nonetheless. Her quiet strength, her unwavering determination during the ordeal, had earned her the respect and trust of the community. They looked to her for guidance, for reassurance, for a vision of a future, free from the shadow of Jedediah's tyranny. Elias, true to his nature, remained on the periphery, a quiet observer. Had done what he set out to do, what he felt compelled to do. Had brought justice to redemption, not for recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. Had helped Belle, not out of pity or romantic interest, but out of a deep-seated sense of fairness, a respect for her resilience in the face of adversity. He spent his days in the surrounding hills, hunting, trapping, living off the land, finding solace in the quiet solitude of the wilderness. Had come into town occasionally to check on Belle, to make sure redemption was truly on the path to recovery. Had sat with her on the porch of a small house, sharing a cup of coffee, their conversations sparse but meaningful, their shared silence a testament to the bond forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias sat with Belle, watching the townsfolk go about their evening routines. The air was filled with the sounds of hammers striking nails, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the gentle strumming of a guitar from a nearby saloon. It was the sound of a town healing, a community rebuilding, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. "It's good to see them like this," Belle said, her voice soft, reflective. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, his face etched with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. He knew the fight for justice was never truly over, that the West remained a wild and unpredictable place. But for now, in this moment, redemption was at peace. "You should stay," Belle said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This town needs you." Elias turned to her, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of uncertainty in their depths. He wasn't a man of towns, of communities. He was a wanderer, a solitary figure who found solace in the vastness of the wilderness. But he saw the sincerity in Belle's eyes, the genuine need for his presence, his quiet strength in this fragile new beginning. He thought of the quiet satisfaction he felt watching the town rebuild, the flicker of hope he saw in the eyes of the children, the quiet respect he felt from the townsfolk. He thought of Belle, her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future. He realized that perhaps he too needed redemption, needed a place to call home, a community to belong to, a purpose beyond his own survival. "All right," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "I'll stay." A smile touched Belle's lips, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, illuminating her face with a warmth that mirrored the setting sun. It was a smile that spoke of gratitude, of hope, of the quiet understanding that bloomed between two souls who had shared the darkness and emerged into the light, stronger, more resilient, their spirits forever intertwined. Oh, in the days that followed, Elias found himself drawn into the rhythm of redemption's rebirth. He helped rebuild the schoolhouse, his carpentry skills honed by years of building shelters in the wilderness. He taught the children how to track animals, how to read the signs of the land, how to survive in the harsh realities of the West. He became a quiet protector, a silent guardian, his presence a reassuring force in the town's newfound peace. He and Belle grew closer, their bond deepening with each shared experience, each quiet conversation, each shared silence. They didn't speak of love, didn't need to. Their actions, their gestures, their shared presence spoke volumes. They found solace in each other's company, a quiet understanding that transcended words, a connection forged in the crucible of adversity. One evening, as they sat on Belle's porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Elias turned to her, his eyes reflecting the vastness of the heavens, the infinite possibilities of the future. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Belle met his gaze, her eyes shining with a quiet joy. "Me neither," she said. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. It was the sound of the West, the sound of freedom, the sound of hope. Elias reached out, his hand gently covering hers, his touch warm, reassuring. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It spoke of a shared past, a shared present, a shared future. It spoke of a bond forged in the heart of the wild, untamed West, a bond that would endure, a bond that would sustain them, a bond that would define their lives, forever intertwined in the heart of redemption. The West remained wild, unpredictable, a land of harsh realities and unforgiving landscapes. But in the small town of redemption, a spark of hope had been ignited, a flicker of humanity that burned bright against the darkness. And in the quiet strength of Belle and Elias, in their shared journey from despair to hope, lay the promise of a new beginning, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the unwavering belief in the possibility of redemption. Even in the wildest corners of the world, the dust settled slow, painting the freshly rebuilt streets of redemption in hues of rose and gold. Elias watched from the porch of the newly repaired general store, a mug of lukewarm coffee cooling in his hand. He wasn't much for sunrises, preferred the quiet hush of pre-dawn, but this one felt different. This sunrise marked a turning point, a new chapter. Belle, astride her sturdy mare, adjusted the saddlebags, her silhouette sharp against the burgeoning light. She looked back at him, a small, almost hesitant smile touching her lips. It was a smile that held 1,000 unspoken words, a smile that acknowledged the shared path they'd walked, the darkness they'd traversed, the light they'd found together. He nodded, a silent farewell, a silent blessing. He wasn't a man of many words, but in that single nod, she saw everything she needed to see: respect, gratitude, a quiet understanding that ran deeper than words. She turned her horse towards the east, towards the rising sun, and spurred it into a gentle canter. He watched her go, the dust swirling around her like a halo, until she disappeared over the crest of a hill, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. He finished his coffee, the bitter taste of familiar comfort, and turned his attention to the town stirring to life around him. The blacksmith's hammer rang out, a rhythmic clang that echoed the heartbeat of redemption. The aroma of baking bread drifted from the bakery, a warm, inviting scent that promised nourishment and comfort. Children's laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now filled the air, a joyous symphony of renewal. Head stayed, just as Belle had asked. Head helped rebuild the schoolhouse, his rough hands surprisingly adept at shaping wood and hammering nails. Head taught the children how to track animals, how to read the signs of the land, how to survive in the harsh realities of the West. Had become, in his own quiet way, a protector, a guardian, a silent pillar of the community. He wasn't comfortable with the label of hero, the accolades that some folks tried to bestow upon him. Had simply done what needed doing, what felt right in his gut. Had helped Belle, not for reward or recognition, but because she deserved justice, because her resilience in the face of adversity had earned his respect. Had found a rhythm in redemption, a sense of belonging he'd never known before. Had always been a loner, a wanderer, comfortable in the solitude of the wilderness. But redemption had offered him something more, something he hadn't realized he was missing: a community, a purpose, a place to call home. He wasn't sure how long he'd stay. The call of the open road, the lure of the unknown, still whispered in his heart. But for now, he was content to remain in redemption, to watch the town flourish, to be a part of its rebirth. He walked down the steps of the general store, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and headed towards the outskirts of town. He had a few traps to check, a deer to dress, a quiet spot by the river where he could find solace in the solitude of nature. He wasn't a man of towns, not entirely, but he was learning to appreciate the quiet comfort of community, the shared humanity that bound them together. He reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the open plains, the vast expanse of the west stretching out before him like a canvas painted in hues of ochre and gold. He paused, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air, the scent of sagebrush and pine filling his lungs. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he'd played a part in redemption's rebirth, that he'd helped bring justice to a town that had been shrouded in darkness. He turned and looked back at Redemption, the small cluster of buildings nestled in the valley, smoke curling from chimneys, the sounds of life echoing through the air. It was a fragile piece, a delicate balance in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. But for now, it was enough. He started walking, his long strides eating up the ground, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, the horizon beckoning him forward. He knew the West remained wild, untamed, a land of endless possibilities and unpredictable dangers. But he also knew that within that wildness, there was beauty, there was hope, there was the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity, to find redemption, even in the darkest of times. He walked on, a solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the western sky, a silent guardian, a quiet hero, his heart filled with a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a sense of peace he'd never known before. He was a man of few words, a man of action, a man who had found his place, his purpose, in the heart of redemption. And as he walked, he knew that he would continue to walk, to wander, to explore the vastness of the West. But he would always carry redemption with him, a reminder of the enduring power of hope, the unwavering strength of the human spirit, quiet beauty of a new dawn in the heart of the wild, untamed West.